Welcome to the Playing Books podcast.
Glad to be here for this one. It's going to be quite a ride.
Oh, absolutely. But before we even get into it, I want you, the listener, to do something for me. Just look at your smartphone or computer right now.
Yeah, literally just hold it in your hand for a second.
Right. Just feel the weight of it. Notice that seamless joining of the glass and the metal.
And, the intuitive way the screen just wakes up the second you touch it.
Exactly. Now, what if I told you that the sleek design, the seamless function, the very existence of that device in your hand was actually born out of a profound sense of childhood abandonment?
I mean, it sounds like a massive psychological leap, right?
It really does.
But when you actually trace the engineering and the aesthetic back to their original source, the connection is, it's startlingly direct.
It is. And that is exactly what our mission is for this episode. We are exploring the searingly intense personality and, frankly, the absolute roller coaster life of a man who revolutionized not just one industry, but six.
6 massive global industries.
Right. Personal computers, animated movies, music, phones, tablet computing, and digital publishing.
It's just an insane resume when you say it all out loud.
It is. And we are basing this entire conversation today on this book, Steve Jobs, by Walter Isaacson.
Such an incredible, exhaustive look at his life.
Yeah, it really is. And we want to unpack how one man's personal demons, his unyielding passions, and his, absolute quest for perfection were quite literally hardwired into the hardware and software you use every single day.
Right into the digital tools you rely on right now.
Exactly. So I want to challenge you as you listen today to let the profound ideas and the unvarnished truths found in this episode actually enhance your own life.
Yeah, there are so many practical lessons here about leadership and focus.
Definitely. And I strongly urge you to purchase this book, Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson, to fully grasp these transformative lessons yourself.
Because, the actual architectural blueprints of our modern digital age are hidden right inside these stories.
They really are. So let's just jump straight into it. We have to start with the foundational trauma that basically built his entire empire.
Right, the adoption.
Yeah.
It is the absolute bedrock of everything that follows. It's the lens through which you have to view his entire life.
Because it wasn't just that he was adopted, it was how he found out, right?
Exactly. The narrative was very deliberately shaped by his adoptive parents, Paul and Clara Jobs.
And they were pretty blue collar, right?
Yeah, very working class. Paul was a mechanic, a repo man, a guy who really worked with his hands. And Clara was an accountant.
Right.
And they never hid his origins from him.
Yeah.
But there's this one incredibly vivid memory he had from when he was, I think, just 6 or 7 years old.
Okay.
He's sitting on the lawn of his house in this regular California suburb, and he's talking to the little girl across the street. And he tells her that he's adopted.
Oh, boy. Kids can be brutal.
They really can. Because she looks at him with that blunt cruelty that only little kids have, and she just flat out asks, does that mean your real parents didn't want you?
Wow. For a 7-year-old to hear that, that is devastating.
It's the ultimate rejection. He actually described that moment later in life as feeling like lightning bolts were going off in his head.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, so he runs into the house, just crying hysterically. And Paul and Clara sit him down, they look him straight in the eye, and they deliver this line that would basically define his entire psychological makeup.
What did they say?
They said, no, you have to understand, we specifically picked you out.
Wow. We specifically picked you out.
And they emphasized every single word of that sentence.
That completely flips the script, doesn't it? It takes this narrative of total rejection and turns it into a narrative of being selected.
Exactly. But it leaves him with this massive psychological duality.
Right, because on one hand, he's still abandoned.
Yes. Discarded by his biological parents for reasons a kid just can't comprehend.
But on the other hand, he's chosen. He's special.
Right. And this paradox forged this deep belief that he was separate from the world.
Yeah.
Like he was an enlightened, special entity who operated totally outside the normal rules of society.
But I'm guessing that also comes with a lot of anxiety.
Oh, a terrifying amount. It left him with this desperate need to control his environment. Because if you control everything...
You can't be abandoned again.
Exactly. If you control every aspect of your world, from the people in your life to the physical objects you interact with, you can never be surprised by rejection.
It's funny. He always pushed back against the idea that his drive came from needing to prove his biological parents wrong.
He did deny that, yeah.
But the people closest to him saw it plain as day. like Chris Ann Brennan, the mother of his first child.
Oh, her insights in the book are just piercing.
They really are. She noted that being put up for adoption left him full of, quote, broken glass.
That phrase is just haunting.
Hmm.
Full of broken glass.
And she had this other quote that really stuck with me. She said, "He who is abandoned is an abandoner." Wow. Yeah.
It's such a sharp metaphor. You just picture this brilliant but incredibly fragile interior that will just cut anyone who tries to get too close.
Right, like an operating system that forcibly sandboxes a corrupted app.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He isolated that trauma so his core system wouldn't crash, but it meant putting up incredibly rigid boundaries.
And that need for control, that sense of being different, it didn't just stop with the adoption. It completely extended to his intellect, which brings us to the carbon microphone story.
Oh, this story's amazing. Set this up for us.
So we established Paul Jobs was this brilliant mechanic, right? He loved rebuilding engines, fixing cars, and he really wanted to pass that love of mechanics down to his son.
Standard father-son garage stuff.
Right. So they're at the workbench in the garage one day, and they're looking at a carbon microphone. Now, to get why this is a big deal, we have to talk about the physics of what they were holding.
Right, because a carbon mic is actually a pretty peculiar piece of early tech.
It is. It works by using sound waves to compress these tiny carbon granules that are trapped between two metal plates. Okay, so you speak into it.
And the sound waves literally push the plates together.
Yeah.
That compresses the carbon, which changes its electrical resistance.
Got it. So it doesn't need some complex electronic amplifier to work.
Exactly. It essentially acts as its own amplifier by modulating a direct electrical current running through it. It's this beautifully simple, almost purely mechanical way to capture sound.
But Paul Jobs is a car guy. He's used to standard radios and mechanical systems. He doesn't know this solid-state quirk.
No, he doesn't. So Paul is explaining to his young son how the microphone works, and he asserts with total, absolute paternal authority that it definitely needs a separate amplifier to function.
But young Steve has been reading up on electronics, right?
Yeah, he's been quietly studying physics.
Yeah.
So he realizes his dad is just flat out wrong.
Oh.
Yeah. He tells his dad it doesn't need an amplifier. They get into an argument about it. And finally, Paul, basically trying to prove his kid wrong, wires the whole thing up and tests it.
I know.
And Paul realizes his son is right. The mic works without the amp.
You know, most young boys would be ecstatic about that.
Yeah.
Winning an argument against your dad, that's like a huge milestone of independence.
But that was not his reaction
Oh.
at all. He later described it as a deeply jarring, almost traumatic moment
Really? Why?
because he suddenly realizes that his father, his absolute hero, the guy who was supposed to know everything about the physical world, is fallible. He didn't know the answer.
Oh, wow.
And it went even deeper. He realized in that moment that he was actually smarter than his parents.
That's a heavy thing for a kid to process.
He said he felt tremendous shame for even having the thought. But it compounded that feeling of detachment we talked about.
Right, so not only is he adopted, not only is he chosen, but now he's operating on a completely different intellectual frequency than the people raising him.
Exactly. The bedrock of his worldview is essentially formed right there. He realizes that traditional authority figures don't inherently possess ultimate truth or superior intelligence.
I mean, it's like building a skyscraper on a foundation that is simultaneously cracked and reinforced with titanium. The crack makes it unstable, but the titanium makes it impenetrable.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because if his parents didn't know the answers, why should he listen to his teachers? Why should he respect corporate executives or the government?
He shouldn't. And he didn't. Once he saw the flaw in the system of authority, he felt absolutely zero obligation to follow rules that he thought were illogical.
He became completely untethered from normal societal expectations.
Totally untethered, which means by the time he hits his teenage years, he is perfectly primed for the cultural explosion that is happening right in his backyard in the 1970s.
Yes, 1970s Silicon Valley. This is such a geographical and cultural anomaly. It wasn't just tech happening there.
Not at all. It was this insane melting pot. You had the highly disciplined, rigid military-industrial complex literally colliding with the hippie counterculture, the anti-war movement, and people seeking spiritual enlightenment.
It's just a wild contrast. Break down that dynamic for us.
Well, during the Cold War, the U.S. government was pouring billions of dollars into defense contractors in the Santa Clara Valley.
Right.
Companies building radar, missile guidance, early mainframes.
Right.
So you have thousands of these brilliant, very straight-laced engineers moving to the area. But at the exact same time, you have the massive cultural rebellion of the 1960s spilling down from San Francisco and Berkeley.
So you've got guys designing microprocessors for nuclear subs by day and then dropping acid and protesting the Vietnam War by night.
Exactly. It's a staggering contradiction. And he is just a sponge soaking all of this up.
So he goes off to Reed College in Oregon, which is a total hotbed for counterculture stuff.
Yeah, but he drops out almost immediately.
Right, because he didn't want to waste his parents' life savings on required classes he thought were boring.
Exactly. But here is the critical part. He drops out, but he doesn't leave.
He just stays on campus.
Yeah. He sleeps on the floors of his friends' dorm rooms. He returns glass Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits just to buy food.
That's dedication to being a drop-in.
Right. And he starts unofficially auditing only the classes that genuinely interest him. Like, of all things, calligraphy.
Which, on the surface, seems completely absurd. I mean, here is a guy who is going to pioneer the personal computer revolution, and he's spending his afternoons taking a class on serif and sans serif typefaces.
Learning about the varying amount of space between different letter combinations.
Yeah, it sounds like a waste of time.
But it was fundamental to who he became. He was learning about the intersection of art and strict mathematical rules.
And he was also reading a lot during this time, right? Particularly one very famous publication.
Oh, absolutely. The Whole Earth Catalog.
Created by Stuart Brand. It's legendary.
It was essentially the internet before the internet existed, just printed on paper. It was this fusion of tools, technology, and counterculture philosophy.
What kind of stuff was in it?
Everything. Organic farming equipment, early computer synthesizers, you name it. But the key was that it treated technology not as some cold corporate thing, but as an instrument for personal liberation.
And it had that famous quote on the back of the final issue.
Right. A photograph of an early morning country road with the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish."
He really internalized that.
He did. He wanted to live at that exact intersection of the humanities and the sciences. But honestly, even more impactful on his brain wiring was his deep dive into Zen Buddhism and psychedelics.
Specifically LSD.
Yes, specifically LSD.
Let's talk about that, because he famously claimed that taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important things he ever did in his life.
Which is a massive statement.
Huge. For a guy who literally built the iPhone, to say taking acid was top 3, what exactly did he think it was doing to his brain?
Well, you have to look at it in the context of the 1970s counterculture. Psychedelics weren't just viewed as party drugs. They were seen as actual tools to break down the ego.
To strip away the linear thinking society forces on you.
Exactly. He felt LSD showed him there was another side to the coin of consciousness. But he didn't just stop at drugs. He paired that psychedelic expansion with the intense, rigorous discipline of Zen Buddhism.
And he took it seriously.
Very. He traveled to India, experienced extreme poverty, meditated relentlessly. He was seeking true enlightenment.
But how does sitting on a cushion meditating translate into designing a computer circuit board?
It translates through the concept of prajna,
Which means?
intuitive wisdom. Then taught him to value intuition over abstract, logical, analytical thought.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
He realized that a calm, intensely focused mind could see the essence of a problem much more clearly than a mind that is just bogged down by complex flowcharts and spreadsheets.
Right, like trying to over-intellectualize everything.
Exactly. In Zen, if you want to understand a flower, you don't dissect it and list its cellular parts. You observe it in its totality.
Oh, wow. So that is the absolute root of his minimalist aesthetic.
Yes, stripping away the non-essential to reveal the pure, unadulterated function of an object.
Okay, I have to push back here, though.
Go for it.
We talk about Zen and intuition and ego death, but the stories from this era don't exactly paint a picture of a serene, egoless monk wandering around campus.
No, they certainly do not.
They paint a picture of a guy who is incredibly calculating. I mean, he meets this guy named Robert Friedland at college, right?
Yes, Friedland was running an apple orchard commune at the time.
And Friedland was very charismatic, but also kind of manipulative, and he taught him this intense, unblinking stare.
Oh, the stare. Yeah.
He literally practiced using silence and sustained eye contact to dominate conversations and just bend people to his will. That doesn't sound like Zen enlightenment to me. That sounds like psychological warfare.
You've hit on the central contradiction of his entire character right there.
Right, because it's a huge disconnect.
It is. He was genuinely seeking spiritual purity, but simultaneously he was developing this toolkit for absolute interpersonal dominance.
And you see this collision perfectly when you look at his relationship with the other Steve Wozniak.
Oh, it was. The dynamic between them is just a fascinating study in ethical contrasts.
Because Wozniak was a pure engineer, an absolute savant with circuit boards. But look at the difference in their upbringing.
Right. We talked about Paul Jobs, the repo man who knew how to hustle for spare parts, who negotiated aggressively.
But Wozniak's father, Jerry, was a totally different breed.
Jerry Wozniak was a brilliant rocket scientist at Lockheed, and he exalted engineering above literally all else.
And he taught his son one absolute unbreakable rule.
Never lie. Extreme honesty is the only acceptable way to live your life.
So you have extreme honesty at Wozniak teaming up with a guy who just learned an unblinking stare to manipulate people.
It is a highly volatile mix.
And it culminates in the famous Atari breakout story, which is really the Rosetta Stone for understanding how he operated in business. Break down the mechanics of this story for us, because it is pretty brutal.
It really is. So it's the mid-1970s. He is working the night shift at Atari, the pioneering video game company.
Right.
And Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, gives him a project. He wants him to design the hardware circuit board for a new arcade game called Breakout.
Which is basically single-player Pong, where you bounce a ball to break a wall of bricks.
Exactly. Now, Bushnell offers him a base fee for the job, but he also offers a cash bonus for every single computer chip he can eliminate from the machine's design.
And we should quickly explain why that matters. In the 1970s, every single microchip on a board cost real money.
Yes, they cost money, they generated heat, and they took up physical space inside the cabinet.
So if you can design a board with 40 chips instead of 80, the company saves an absolute fortune when they mass-produce thousands of these arcade games.
Exactly. It's a massive financial incentive.
Yeah.
But there's a problem. He knows he can't actually do the complex engineering himself.
Right. He's the visionary, but Wozniak is the actual hardware wizard.
So he recruits Wozniak. He promises to split the base fee evenly if Wozniak does the heavy lifting on the design work.
And Wozniak, being a genius, agrees. He works for 4 days straight, practically with no sleep.
He essentially does the work of an entire engineering department in less than a week. It was a miracle.
And he pulls it off. He reduces the design by an astonishing 45 chips.
It's a masterpiece of elegant engineering. And Bushnell is thrilled. He pays out the base fee, and he pays out a massive cash bonus for those 45 saved chips.
But here is the crux of the story. The moment that defines the darker side of his psychology. What does he do?
He lies to Wozniak.
He's flat out lies.
He tells Wozniak they only got the base fee.
Yeah.
He gives Wozniak his half of that very small amount, and he quietly pockets the entire massive bonus for himself.
He rips off his best friend, the guy who did all the actual work.
He absolutely did. And Wozniak didn't find out about it until a decade later.
Wait, a decade later? How did he finally find out?
He read about it in a book published about the history of Atari.
Oh my God. Imagine reading a book and finding out your best friend scammed you 10 years ago.
I know. But when Wozniak was asked about it, his reaction is just heartbreakingly pure.
What did he say?
He didn't scream. He didn't sue him. Wozniak later said, "If he had told me he needed the money, he should have known I would have just given it to him. He was a friend." And Wozniak concluded by saying, "Ethics always mattered to me, but people are different."
That is such a devastatingly polite way to say the man I built Apple with betrayed me for a few $1,000.
It really is.
So looking at that Atari story, I have to ask, was his deep dive into Zen and spirituality just a costume? Like, was he genuinely seeking enlightenment, or was he just weaponizing mindfulness to clear his head so he could become a more effective corporate predator?
See, he's not either. In his mind, it was absolutely both.
How does that work?
He genuinely craved spiritual purity. He craved aesthetic perfection. He wanted to build beautiful things that elevated humanity.
Okay.
But he was absolutely willing to discard ethical purity to achieve those goals. He didn't see a contradiction between ripping off his friend and seeking Zen enlightenment.
Because the ends justified the means.
Exactly. He believed his ultimate vision was so important that the normal rules of human conduct simply didn't apply to him. He felt he wasn't bound by the morality of the masses.
It's a terrifying mindset, but also incredibly potent if you are actually trying to change the world.
Undeniably.
Because this absolute willingness to bend reality, ethics, and physics for a singular goal became his ultimate superpower when he and Wozniak finally started their own company.
Which brings us to the forging of Apple and the birth of the infamous reality distortion field.
Yes. Let's start with the transition from a garage hobby to a real corporation. They build the Apple I circuit board, sell a few to local hobbyists.
But to really build a company, to manufacture the much more advanced Apple II, they need massive capital, they need supply chains, they need business expertise.
They essentially need adult supervision.
Exactly. And enter Mike Markula.
Markula is one of the most unsung heroes in business history.
He truly is. Markula was a retired Intel executive, only in his early 30s, but he had already made millions on stock options.
He drove a gold Corvette, right?
Yes, the gold Corvette. And he deeply understood finance, distribution, and marketing.
So he visits the garage.
Right. He visits the Jobs family garage. He looks past these barefoot kids with long hair who smell like they haven't showered in a week.
Which they probably hadn't.
Probably not. But Markula sees the future in Wozniak's Apple II prototype. He writes them a massive check, guarantees a bank loan, and becomes an equal partner.
And Markula becomes the father figure that he actually respects because Markula has knowledge he doesn't possess.
Precisely. And Markula establishes Apple's 3 core marketing principles, which are honestly profound and still dictate how the company operates today.
Empathy, focus, and impute.
They are the very DNA of Apple.
Let's break those down. Empathy.
Empathy meant truly understanding the customer's needs better than any other company. You don't just sell them a machine. You understand their pain points before they even realize they have them.
Right. And focus.
Focus meant eliminating all unimportant opportunities. You have to ignore 100 good ideas to execute one great idea perfectly.
But the third principle, impute, that was Markula's masterstroke. And it resonated so deeply with his young protege's obsession with aesthetics.
Yes. Explain the mechanics of impute, because it's not a word we use often in daily business.
Sure. Well, Markula explained that impute means human beings absolutely do judge a book by its cover. It is a psychological inevitability.
You can't help it.
Right. So Markula says if you have the best, most advanced product in the world, but you present it in a slipshod manner, like in a plain brown cardboard box with a confusing manual, people will instinctively impute that the product inside is slipshod and cheap.
But if you present it creatively,
Exactly. If you present it in a beautifully designed box with crisp typography, you impute the desired qualities of the product before they even turn it on. The packaging matters just as much as the silicon chips inside.
which perfectly explains why unboxing an Apple product today feels like a religious ceremony.
It really does.
Right.
The friction of the box sliding open, the perfectly wrapped cables, it's all psychological conditioning, and it all traces straight back to Mike Markula in 1977.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
But while Markula is establishing the external marketing, inside the company, a very different, much darker force was taking hold.
The reality distortion field.
The RDF.
Where did that term actually come from?
It was actually coined by Bud Tribble, who was a software designer on the early Macintosh team in the 1980s.
And it's a Star Trek reference, right?
It is. He borrowed it from an episode of Star Trek where these aliens create a completely convincing alternate reality.
So why did Tribble start using it at Apple?
He used it to explain to the new, terrified engineers why they couldn't trust the project deadlines they were being given by their boss. Tribble would say, in his presence, reality is malleable. He can convince anyone of practically anything.
So it wasn't just him being a fast-talking car salesman. It was a complete psychological ecosystem.
Based on a strictly binary worldview.
Right, the gods and the shithead.
Exactly. He categorized everything and everyone into two extreme polarized buckets. People were either enlightened geniuses or they were shitheads.
No in between.
None. A piece of work was either the best thing ever created or it was totally shitty. There was absolutely no room for good enough.
And the terrifying part for his employees was that the categories weren't permanent.
Oh, not at all.
Yeah.
If you were a god on Monday because you solved a tough coding problem, you could instantly be a shithead on Tuesday if you chose the wrong font for a menu.
It kept everyone in a permanent state of terrified adrenaline.
Constant fight or flight.
You would think that kind of management would cause a company to instantly implode, but the wild thing is, it worked.
It wasn't just bullying. It was a self-fulfilling distortion of physics and human endurance.
Let's talk about the famous boot time anecdote, because I think it perfectly illustrates how he manipulated people into doing the impossible.
Okay, so this happens during the development of the Macintosh. He walks into the cubicle of an engineer named Larry Kenyon.
And Kenyon is working on the core operating system, right?
Yes. And he starts complaining to Kenyon that the computer is taking way too long to boot up when you turn it on.
Now, Kenyon is a rational engineer, so he starts giving the technical, mechanical reasons why it takes that long.
Right, he's defending the laws of physics. The computer has to load drivers, run memory checks, initialize the hardware. It's bound by the physical read speed of the floppy disk drive.
But he doesn't want to hear about physics.
No. He cuts Kenyon off entirely. He shifts the entire paradigm from engineering to morality.
How so?
He asks Kenyon, if it could save a person's life, would you find a way to shave 10 seconds off the boot time?
Wow. That's a heavy question to drop on a programmer.
Kenyon is taken aback, obviously. And he admits that, well, if a life were on the line, he probably could find a way.
And then the math starts.
Right. He goes to the whiteboard. He tells Kenyon to imagine that 5 million people eventually use the Mac. If it takes 10 seconds extra to turn it on every single day, that adds up to 50 million seconds a day.
Which is roughly 300 million hours a year.
Exactly. He looks at Kenyon and says, that is the equivalent of at least 100 human lifetimes saved every single year.
So he completely reframed a boring technical coding problem into a life or death moral imperative?
He made Larry Kenyon feel like a surgeon who was letting patients die on the operating table because his code was sloppy.
That is insane. Did it work?
Oh, it worked. A few weeks later, Kenyon completely rewrote the initialization sequence and got the machine to boot up 28 seconds faster.
28 seconds. He achieved the impossible because his boss literally refused to acknowledge that it was impossible.
It's like he built a cult around engineering.
And he tied all of this intense pressure directly to his obsessive focus on aesthetics. He wasn't just screaming about the circuit boards.
No, he was screaming about the exact shade of the plastic case.
We have to talk about Pantone beige.
Oh, the Pantone beige. During the Apple II and early Mac days, he was obsessed with the color of the computer cases.
Now, for those who don't know, the Pantone matching system is a standardized color reproduction system used in manufacturing globally.
Right. It ensures that a designer in California and a plastics factory in Taiwan are talking about the exact same wavelength of light.
So what was his issue with it?
He spent weeks arguing with designers and manufacturers over the exact shade of beige. He rejected dozens of samples because they were slightly too yellow or a little too gray.
He wasn't just being picky. He was demanding total supply chain control over aesthetics.
And he also demanded that the massive industrial machines in the factory be painted in bright, specific colors.
Wait, really? The factory machines?
Yes. And he wanted the engineering workbenches to be pure white.
Which is insane. It's an electronics workshop. You are soldering, dealing with flux, metal shavings, pure white.
It was about instilling a mindset. He wanted the environment to reflect the purity of the products.
That reminds me of the Tiffany glass story.
Yes. When designing the graphical software interface for the Mac, he actually took the core team of programmers to an exhibit of Louis Comfort Tiffany glass in Manhattan.
Just to look at art?
He wanted to show them that great, historic, sublime art could be mass-produced. He explicitly told these coders that they were artists, not just engineers.
Which leads directly to the pirate flag.
The pirate flag.
The Mac team was physically separated from the rest of the company in their own building, right?
Yeah, and he instilled this intense rebel spirit in them. He famously told them, it's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy.
So they literally ran a pirate flag with a rainbow apple logo up the flagpole over their building.
And their unifying mantra became, the journey is the reward.
It was an incredibly effective motivational tactic.
Because he isolated them. He made them feel like they were a special, elite corps on a historic mission to dent the universe.
While simultaneously framing everyone else in the company, the Navy, as boring bureaucrats.
Exactly.
You know, hearing all this, I keep thinking about a symphony orchestra.
How so?
Well, the reality distortion field is like a conductor demanding that the orchestra play a note that doesn't physically exist on their instruments. The musicians tell them it's impossible. The physics of the brass and woodwinds just don't allow it.
All right.
But through sheer terror, screaming, and this weird spiritual inspiration, they blow into their horns, and somehow, against the laws of physics, they actually play the note.
That's a great way to put it.
So I have to ask you, is it actually possible to achieve true greatness, to build something that genuinely changes the world, without a leader who ignores the bounds of reality and basic human empathy?
What's deeply uncomfortable, but historically accurate, is that the people who survived that gauntlet, the ones who were yelled at, demeaned, pushed past their breaking points, almost universally say they did the best work of their lives under him.
Really? Even after all the abuse?
Yeah, I mean, they hated the abuse. Many of them needed therapy afterward, but they valued the fact that he absolutely refused to accept B-level work. He forced them to discover capacities they didn't even know they possessed.
Wow. But there is a massive bill that comes due when you operate like that. Ignoring reality eventually catches up with you.
It always does.
When you push everyone to the brink, when you treat your colleagues as binary extremes, and when you actively alienate your own allies, you are setting the stage for your own spectacular downfall.
And that brings us to the Icarus Fall.
Let's set the scene. We are in the early 1980s.
Right. Apple is no longer a startup in a garage. It is a massive, publicly traded corporation growing at a terrifying speed.
And the board of directors realizes they have a problem.
They do. They and the investors realize they need a seasoned, professional CEO to manage the massive logistics of the business.
While he focuses on his obsession, the Macintyre,
Exactly. So he sets his sights on John Scully.
who was a very big deal at the time.
Huge. Scully was a highly successful, highly respected executive at Pepsi-Cola.
Now, Scully is understandably hesitant. Why would he leave the comfort of a massive East Coast conglomerate to go wrangle a bunch of barefoot hackers in California?
Scully was a traditional corporate guy, but he also had an ego.
Right.
He flew out to California. They met several times, but Scully kept balking at the final decision.
Until they're in New York.
Yes. They're standing together overlooking Central Park, and he delivers what is arguably the greatest, most psychologically devastating recruiting pitch in business history.
It's a surgical strike on a man's legacy. He looks Scully dead in the eye and asks, do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want a chance to change the world?
It was brilliant. He didn't offer him more money. He offered him historical significance.
He challenged Scully's ego in one breath, framing his entire successful career at Pepsi as trivial and meaningless.
And Scully had no defense against that. He took the job.
And initially, they are a dream team, the visionary and the operator.
Right, and they launched the Macintosh in 1984 with an event that permanently altered marketing.
The legendary Super Bowl ad, directed by Ridley Scott.
The 1984 ad.
Which is amazing because it didn't show a single feature of the computer.
Not one. It didn't show a keyboard or a screen or what the software did.
It just showed this dystopian gray world of mindless drones being lectured to by a big brother figure on a giant screen.
Which everyone inherently understood represented IBM.
Right. And then this vibrant, athletic woman in a brightly colored tank top runs down the aisle, swinging a sledgehammer, and smashes the screen.
Freeing the minds of the people. It completely positioned Apple not as a technology company, but as the ultimate rebel force fighting for human freedom.
It was a total masterpiece. But the success of that ad masked a growing, fatal rot inside the company.
Entirely generated by his unchecked ego.
The reality distortion field had a fatal side effect. It made him blind to the resentment brewing in his own ranks.
Remember the pirate flag?
Yeah, he made the Mac team feel like gods.
Which meant he treated the Apple II team like absolute garbage.
And the economic reality of the company made this dynamic entirely unsustainable.
Because the Macintosh, while beautiful, was incredibly expensive. It was very slow, and it had hardly any software. It was struggling to sell after the initial hype.
Meanwhile, the Apple II, the ugly, boring machine built by the people he openly mocked, was the cash cow, generating practically all of the company's revenue.
He completely alienated the very people paying his bills and keeping the lights on.
He created a toxic civil war, and his personal behavior became more and more erratic as the pressure mounted.
He was crying in meetings, throwing tantrums, insulting executives.
Which leads to a brutal confrontation with Joanna Hoffman.
Joanna Hoffman was one of the original Mac team members, and she was one of the only people on Earth who possessed the armor to stand up to him.
She was a brilliant physicist and marketing expert, right?
Yes, and utterly fearless. One day, she marches into his office after he has been particularly cruel and unreasonable to someone on her team.
What does she say?
She tells him point blank that she used to think it was a profound privilege to work at Apple, but his unhinged behavior is destroying the company from the inside.
And how does he react? Does he use the stare?
He tries to. He tries to employ his unblinking stare, trying to dominate her with silence, but she doesn't flinch.
Wow.
She recoils and tells him, when I look into your eyes, I see a bottomless pit, an empty hole, a dead zone.
A dead zone. That goes right back to the crack in the foundation we talked about at the very beginning.
It does.
The trauma of abandonment left a void that couldn't be filled by stock prices or beautiful typography.
And eventually, The board of directors and John Scully realize they have to amputate the limb to save the body.
This situation just becomes completely untenable.
So 1985, Scully goes to the board and demands they remove him from running the Macintosh division.
And the board looks at the financials, and they side with Scully.
The founder is stripped of all operating power. He is given an empty office in a back building, which people jokingly referred to as Siberia.
Recognizing he has been completely neutralized, he resigns.
At age 30, he is essentially exiled from the empire he created in his parents' garage.
It's a devastating public humiliation. But years later, he reflected on this moment with surprising clarity.
He did.
He said getting fired from Apple was the best thing that ever happened to him, because the heavy burden of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again.
It freed him to enter what we can call the wilderness years.
And the wilderness years are just a fascinating study in unchecked hubris and accidental brilliance.
He decides to prove Apple wrong by founding a new computer company called NXT.
But this time he has massive personal wealth and absolutely no board of directors to restrain him.
So NXT becomes an exercise in indulging every single obsessive perfectionist instinct he possesses.
I mean, he spent a fortune before they even built a machine. He paid Paul Rand, the famous graphic designer, $100,000 just to design the logo.
And that was just the beginning.
Yeah.
He insisted the computer itself had to be a perfect, seamless magnesium cube, painted flat black.
Do you know how difficult it is to cast a perfect magnesium cube with perfect right angles?
It required custom manufacturing techniques. He demanded the factory assembly line robots be painted in specific shades of gray.
And the result.
The computers they finally released were beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
and they possessed incredible software, but they were monstrously expensive.
No, nobody bought them.
Almost nobody. NXT was a spectacular market flop.
But we need to pause here and explain why NXT is actually the most important failure in tech history.
Because of the software.
Right. While the black cube didn't sell, the software inside it, NXT, was revolutionary. Explain object-oriented programming to the listener, because this is really the secret sauce of the modern digital world.
Okay, so object-oriented programming, or OOP, fundamentally changed how software was built.
How was it done before?
Before this, writing software was like writing a massive, linear novel. If you wanted to change one thing, you risked breaking the entire story.
A total house of cards.
Exactly. OOP, which NXT perfected, changed the paradigm to building blocks. Instead of writing linear code, you build self-contained objects like a digital button or a text box or a scrolling window.
And these objects contain both their own data and the instructions for how they behave.
Yes. So if a developer wants to build a new program, they don't have to code a button from scratch. They just drag and drop the pre-existing button object from a library.
It allowed for incredibly rapid, modular, infinitely scalable software development.
It was decades ahead of its time. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee actually used a NXT computer to invent the World Wide Web because the software was so advanced.
So while NXT is burning through hundreds of millions of dollars on hardware nobody wants, he makes a side bet.
He buys a small, obscure computer graphics division from George Lucas for $10 million.
A little company called Pixar.
And it was crucial to note he didn't buy Pixar because he loved animation.
No. Why did he buy it?
He bought it thinking he was going to sell their high-end graphics hardware, the Pixar image computer, to hospitals for MRI rendering and to architects.
Oh, wow.
He viewed the animation department, which was led by John Lasseter, as just a side project to demonstrate the hardware.
But the hardware failed to sell, just like NXT hardware.
Right. But he realized that while the computers weren't selling, the animators were using a proprietary software called RenderMan to create digital magic.
So he stopped trying to be a hardware company and pivoted to being an entertainment studio.
And here is where we see his evolving genius for organizational design. When Pixar eventually partnered with Disney and became wildly successful, they built a new headquarters.
Right.
He didn't just want a nice office building, he wanted to architect a machine that manufactured creativity.
This is one of my favorite lessons from his life. He designed a massive building with a giant central atrium.
Yes, and against the wishes of many employees, he put the only bathrooms, the cafe, and the employee mailboxes right in the center of that atrium.
He forced serendipity.
Exactly. In a normal company, the computer scientists stay in their wing and the artists stay in theirs. By putting the essential services in the middle, he forced the hardcore coders to physically bump into the creative animators multiple times a day.
Because he understood that the most innovative ideas don't happen in scheduled meetings. They happen in random, unscripted encounters when different disciplines collide.
His brilliant space planning.
So we often romanticize these wilderness years as a time of profound learning and maturation. But I want to push back on that narrative a bit. Did he actually learn how to manage people during this time? Did he become a better leader? Or did he just get incredibly, astronomically lucky that the object-oriented software NXT built happened to be exactly what Apple desperately needed a decade later, and that Pixar happened to make Toy Story?
It's a complex mix of both. He certainly didn't become a softer, gentler manager. He was still screaming at people at NXT.
Right.
But he did learn patience, entirely out of necessity. Making a fully computer-animated movie like Toy Story takes 4 to 5 years of agonizing frame-by-frame rendering. Building a computer takes 1 year.
Pixar forced him to learn how to play the long game.
It did. But your point about luck is valid. He was bleeding money. If Toy Story had flopped at the box office, he likely would have been financially ruined and written off as a historical footnote.
And while he was experiencing these massive, stressful professional failures and artistic triumphs in the wilderness, his personal life was undergoing an equally dramatic, messy reckoning with his past.
Which brings us to the personal reckoning.
This is where the narrative loops back to the very beginning, to the trauma of abandonment.
We discussed how his biological father was 23 years old when he abandoned him. Well, history has a dark sense of irony.
It really does.
When he himself was 23 years old, just as Apple was taking off, he got his high school girlfriend, Chris Ann Brennan, pregnant.
And his reaction was to utilize his reality distortion field on himself.
He completely, vehemently denied paternity.
He didn't just deny it privately, she denied it publicly. He essentially created a separate partition on his hard drive for his empathy and just locked it away.
He even claimed in legal documents that he was sterile and named other men she might have been with, which was entirely untrue.
It was a staggering level of denial and cruelty. He even named the new, incredibly expensive Apple computer the Lisa, which was the exact name of the child.
But he publicly insisted to the press and his employees that it was an acronym for Local Integrated Software Architecture.
A complete compartmentalization of reality.
Yeah.
He sandboxed the child so she couldn't consume his emotional processing power.
But as he matured, slightly, during the wilderness years, the walls of that sandbox began to crack. He began to seek out his origins.
You hired a private investigator, right?
Yes, and tracked down his biological mother, Joanne. They met, and it was very emotional. She was deeply apologetic for giving him up.
And through her, he discovered he had a full biological sister he had never met.
The acclaimed novelist Mona Simpson. They met in New York and formed an incredibly close, profound bond.
But the story of their biological father, Abdul Fattah Jandali, is one of the most statistically improbable Shakespearean things I've ever read. Break down how this played out because it defies belief.
So Mona decides she wants to track down their biological father. He explicitly tells her he doesn't want anything to do with the man, but Mona goes anyway.
She hires a detective.
Right, and eventually finds Jandali, a Syrian immigrant, running a small, quiet restaurant in Sacramento.
So Mona goes to meet him.
They are sitting there having a polite conversation, and Jandali is boasting a bit about his past to impress his new daughter.
As you do.
He mentions that before this, he used to manage a much larger, fancier Mediterranean restaurant down in Silicon Valley.
Okay.
And he says, all the successful technology people used to come there. Even Steve Jobs used to come in. And he was a sweet guy and a big tipper.
Just pause and imagine Mona's face in that moment.
She is absolutely stunned.
Right.
But she manages to keep her composure and doesn't tell Jandali the truth about who that famous customer actually was.
She leaves, immediately calls her brother, they meet at a cafe, and she tells him the story.
And he realizes that he had actually been to that specific restaurant multiple times.
He had actually met his biological father, looked him in the eye, and shaken his hand, completely unaware of the genetic link between them.
It is the definition of irony. But what's truly revealing about his character is his reaction.
What does he do?
Even after finding this out, even after the universe presented him with this incredible coincidence, he absolutely refused to ever establish a relationship with Jandali. He couldn't forgive the fact that Jandali had abandoned Mona when she was a child. Yet, simultaneously, he was slowly starting to repair his relationship with his own abandoned daughter, Lisa, who eventually moved into his house during her teenage years.
It's a messy, contradictory emotional landscape. And during this time, he also meets and marries Laureen Powell.
She seems to be the grounded anchor he desperately needed to stabilize that landscape.
Laureen was incredibly smart, possessed a degree from an elite university, and was completely unimpressed by his wealth or his fame.
She challenged him intellectually. They built a real family life together. They had 3 children, Reed, Aaron, and Eve.
And despite being a billionaire from the Pixar IPO, he insisted on living in a normal house in a regular, leafy neighborhood in Palo Alto.
He had no security detail, no massive gates. He wanted to teach his kids that material wealth clutters life, which was a lasting remnant of his Buddhist days.
But I have to point out the glaring, almost painful irony here.
Go ahead.
Here is a man who dedicates his life to creating devices that perfectly organize our world. Files neatly tucked away in digital folders, music beautifully categorized by genre, user interfaces that are entirely intuitive and predictable. Yes. Yet his own emotional life was incredibly messy, reactive, and compartmentalized. Does extreme genius require you to compartmentalize your empathy? Do you have to shut off a fundamental part of your humanity to focus that intensely on building a product?
You've hit on the core philosophical debate of his life. His intense, world-changing focus required him to brutally filter out distractions.
And people were distractions.
Often, yes.
Well,
Human emotions, the messy needs of others, and even his own past traumas were treated as mere static, as distractions from the pure signal of the product.
wow.
He filtered them out so he could focus the absolute laser of his attention on the screen in front of him. It was a coping mechanism born of childhood trauma that evolved into a highly effective, if destructive, management style.
But with his family life stabilizing and his ego bruised but matured by the brutal lessons of Nexty and Pixar, the stage was set for the greatest second act in the history of American business.
Apple was about to come calling.
Let's get into the restoration and the era of the digital hub. Set the scene for us in 1996.
Apple is in a death spiral. They are bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars. Their market share has evaporated to Windows PCs, and they are literally 90 days from bankruptcy.
What is their core problem?
The core problem is that their operating system is antiquated, and their internal project to build a new one, codenamed Copeland, is a bloated, unmitigated disaster.
So they desperately need a modern, stable software core to survive.
Exactly. So they look around the market, and they realize that the black cube company that failed, NXT, actually has the most advanced Unix-based operating system on Earth,
So Apple buys Nexty for $400 million just to get its software.
which would eventually become Mac OS X. But with NXT comes the founder.
He returns to Apple initially as an advisor.
But within months, he orchestrates a masterful, ruthless boardroom coup, ousting the CEO who bought his company, and installs himself as the interim CEO.
He's back. And the very first thing he does to save a company that is drowning in hardware inventory isn't to launch a new computer.
No, it's to launch a marketing campaign, the Think Different campaign.
This was a masterclass in reestablishing corporate identity. Apple was viewed as a loser at this point.
He needed to change the narrative instantly. He didn't want to talk about processor speeds or megabytes of RAM. He wanted to remind people what Apple stood for at its soul.
The campaign featured stunning black and white photos of his personal heroes, right?
Albert Einstein, Mahatma Gandhi, Bob Dylan, Amelia Earhart, Muhammad Ali. The message was clear. Apple isn't for corporate drones. Apple is for the rebels, the troublemakers, the crazy ones who push the human race forward.
And his reality distortion field is operating at peak capacity here.
Oh, absolutely.
He is so utterly obsessed with getting exactly the right emotional resonance that he personally calls the editor-in-chief of Time magazine to bully him into releasing a specific copyrighted photo of Gandhi spinning thread. He takes no prisoners.
But the beautiful marketing was just air cover for his actual business salvation, a strategy he called the digital hub.
This is the intellectual pivot that changed modern life.
At the time, computers were basically viewed as glorified typewriters and spreadsheet machines for the office.
Right.
He looked at the rapidly evolving landscape of digital cameras and early MP3 files and realized that the personal computer shouldn't just be a tool for work. It should be the central hub for your entire digital lifestyle.
The computer becomes the mothership that manages your digital photos, your digital videos, and your digital music.
But if the Mac is the hub, it means Apple can't just make computers anymore.
They have to make the spokes. They have to make the mobile devices that connect to the hub.
Precisely. And to manifest this vision into physical reality, He formed the most important creative partnership of his life with a brilliant, quiet, incredibly talented British designer named Joni Ive.
I've shared his absolute obsession with Bauhaus design.
Yes. For those who aren't design nerds, Bauhaus was a German architectural and design movement from the 1920s that dictated that form must always follow function.
It was about stripping away unnecessary flowery ornamentation to reveal the pure utility of an object.
And Ive took that philosophy to the extreme. Ive's philosophy was something he called deep simplicity.
Explain that, because when people hear simplicity, they just think of a blank white box, but that's not what I've meant.
Right. I've explained that true simplicity isn't just the absence of clutter. It's not just painting over a messy machine to hide the wires.
Okay, what is it then?
To achieve true simplicity, you have to dig through the absolute depth of the complexity. You have to deeply understand the essence of a product, how it's manufactured, what every single internal component does, the physics of heat dissipation. Only then can you figure out what is truly non-essential and eliminate it. If a device requires 4 screws, I would figure out how to mill the case out of a single piece of extruded aluminum so it required 0 screws.
It's a fundamental reimagining of the creation.
And he applied this concept of stripping away the non-essential to the corporate culture, too.
Right. When he returned, Apple was making dozens of confusing variations of computers and printers.
He initiated massive product reviews, brutally cutting Apple's sprawling product line down to a simple quadrant. Just 4 core computers: consumer, pro, desktop, portable.
And in these meetings, he famously banned the use of PowerPoint presentations.
He detested PowerPoint. He believed it was a crutch for lazy thinking.
He actually said, people who know what they're talking about don't need PowerPoint.
He wanted his executives to engage dynamically, to argue with him, to hash things out at the whiteboard, not just passively read off bulleted slides in a dark room.
It forced a level of intellectual rigor and combative debate that had been completely missing from Apple.
So this focused corporate culture, married to the digital hub strategy, gives birth to the iPod.
1,000 songs in your pocket.
The iPod is the massive turning point. Apple creates iTunes software to easily rip CDs to the Mac, and the incredibly simple iPod hardware to carry the music.
The scroll wheel was a masterpiece of user interface, and the advertising slogan was brilliant and provocative: rip, mix, burn.
But that slogan and the ease of the device put him on a direct collision course with the massive, entrenched entertainment conglomerates.
Michael Eisner, the powerful CEO of Disney, actually went before the United States Senate and blasted Apple, basically accusing them of aiding and abetting digital piracy.
Eisner and the record executives were terrified of Napster and illegal downloading. They didn't get it.
They didn't understand that consumers didn't want to steal, they just wanted to unbundle the album. They wanted to pay for the one good song, not the 14 tracks of filler.
Exactly. The music industry wanted to lock everything down with restrictive DRM, digital rights management.
But he understood that if you give people a legal, reliable, beautifully designed, and reasonably priced alternative to piracy, the vast majority of people will happily pay for it.
He aggressively negotiated with the record labels, using his reality distortion field to convince them to sell songs for 99 cents on the new iTunes Music Store.
He essentially dragged the entire recording industry kicking and screaming into the digital age and saved them from Napster in the process.
And the success of the iPod provided the capital and the confidence to shrink the technology further.
From the iPod, we get the iPhone, which shifts from the physical scroll wheel to the capacitive multi-touch screen, allowing the interface to adapt to whatever app is open.
And then, expanding that screen, we get the iPad.
And it all culminates in this slide he would proudly show at the end of his keynote presentations. It was a street sign showing the intersection of Technology Street and Liberal Arts Street.
That image was his ultimate thesis statement. It was the culmination of his calligraphy classes, his Zen meditation, and his engineering obsession.
He believed that technology alone is not enough.
It's cold and lifeless. It is technology married with the liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the results that make our hearts sing.
But it wasn't always a smooth ride, even at the peak of his power. When the iPad was announced, the initial backlash was fierce.
People mocked the name. The hashtag iTampon was trending on Twitter for days.
Bill Gates publicly dismissed it as just a big phone. Tech critics complained that it didn't have a camera, it couldn't multitask, it didn't have a physical keyboard.
But he completely ignored the focus groups, the critics, and the media. He famously stated that it wasn't his job to use focus groups because consumers don't know what they want until he shows it to them.
It sounds arrogant, but he was proven spectacularly right. The iPad became the fastest-selling consumer electronics product in history at the time, creating an entirely new category of computing.
However, this total uncompromising control over the hardware, the software, and even the apps allowed on the device sparked a massive ongoing philosophical debate in the tech world.
The open versus closed system debate.
Yes,
We have to analyze this because it defines the modern internet.
it really does.
On one side, you have the Microsoft or Google Android model.
Right.
Write the software, license it to anyone, let Dell or Samsung build the hardware, let users tinker and customize. Open it up.
And on his side, the Apple model. Tight end-to-end integration. The hardware, the operating system, the App Store, it's all fiercely controlled by Apple.
I want to bring up a quote from the technology critic Cory Doctorow. He argued that Apple devices show a palpable contempt for the owner by being sealed shut.
Because you can't open an iPad, you can't easily change the battery, you can't install software outside of their approved store.
Right. So I ask you, is the Apple ecosystem a beautiful, serene Zen garden that protects you, or is it a highly restrictive digital prison?
It's the ultimate paradox of his legacy, and it stems directly from his childhood need for control. He fundamentally believed that to deliver a sublime, seamless, crash-free user experience, you had to control every single variable. If you let third parties build crappy hardware or write buggy, malicious software, it pollutes the perfection of the experience and ruins the art.
So it's both.
Yes, it's absolutely a walled garden. It is a golden cage. You are trading your technical freedom and your ability to tinker for reliability, security, and beauty. For hackers, engineers, and open source advocates, it is a prison. But for the vast majority of everyday consumers who just want their devices to work flawlessly out of the box, it is a perfectly manicured Zen garden.
This need for absolute end-to-end control drove Apple to become the most valuable company on the face of the earth. He bent to multiple industries to his exact will.
But he soon faced the one biological system he absolutely could not negotiate with: bully or control.
Which brings us to our final section, the Twilight struggle and legacy.
In the midst of this staggering professional triumph, at the absolute height of his powers, he is diagnosed with cancer, specifically a pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor.
And his reaction to the diagnosis is deeply revealing of his psychology. What's tragic is that this specific type of pancreatic cancer is actually rare because it is slow-growing and, if caught early, highly curable with surgery.
Exactly. It wasn't an immediate death sentence, but for 9 agonizing months, he adamantly refused the surgery that could have saved his life.
Which is absolutely maddening. He is a billionaire with access to the greatest medical minds on the planet, and he says no to the cure. Why?
Because he treated his own biological body the exact same way he treated a product design or a tough business negotiation.
He applied the reality distortion field.
He fundamentally believed that if he willed it to be so, he could hack his own biology. He tried to cure the cancer with extreme vegan diets, acupuncture, bowel cleansings, and herbal remedies.
He didn't want to be violated by a surgeon's knife.
Right. He later expressed profound regret for this stubbornness, but it showed how deeply ingrained his belief in his own specialness was. He thought the rules of cellular biology didn't apply to him.
But eventually, the reality of the scans forces his hand. He has the surgery, and years later he requires a liver transplant.
And living with this diagnosis changes him, but not in the softened, peaceful way you might expect from someone facing mortality.
It didn't make him step back, retire, and go sit on a beach.
No, it became a memento mori, a stark daily reminder of death. The cancer acted as a powerful catalyst.
Instead of humbling him into submission, it made him more aggressive, more impatient, and more fearless.
He realized his time was strictly limited, so he dropped all the remaining pleasantries and social niceties. He had nothing left to lose, so he operated with absolute, unfiltered purity of purpose.
He articulated this philosophy perfectly in his incredibly moving 2005 Stanford commencement speech.
He stood before the graduates and said, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life."
He literally called death very likely the single best invention of life because it clears out the old and obsolete to make way for the new.
And you see this new level of fearlessness in how he handled massive corporate crises in his final years. Take the infamous Antennagate crisis with the launch of the iPhone 4.
Oh, this is a perfect example of his reality distortion meeting physics. Explain what happened.
The iPhone 4 was a beautiful piece of design featuring a stainless steel band around the outside. But that steel band was actually the phone's cellular antenna.
Okay.
If a user held the phone in a very specific way, gripping the lower left corner, Their sweaty skin would bridge the gap between two antennas, shorting the circuit and causing the cellular signal to drop completely.
The press went wild. Consumer Reports refused to recommend the phone. The standard corporate PR playbook dictates that you issue a groveling apology, recall the product, and fire the engineer responsible.
But he takes a playbook, sets it on fire, and completely rewrites the narrative.
What is too?
He calls an emergency press conference. He walks out, looks at the hostile media, and bluntly says, "We're not perfect. Phones aren't perfect."
And then he brings up the data.
Right? He presents exhaustive laboratory data, proving that every single smartphone on the market, from competitors like BlackBerry and Samsung, also drops calls when gripped tightly in certain spots.
He didn't apologize for a design flaw. He changed the entire context of the argument.
He offered a free plastic bumper case to anyone who wanted one, but he refused to admit defeat. And it completely deflated the outrage. The phone went on to break sales records.
It was a masterclass in holding the high ground and refusing to surrender the narrative. But as the cancer relentlessly progressed, spreading through his body, his physical energy drastically waned, even as his mental acuity remained razor-sharp.
He spent his final weeks at his home in Palo Alto, surrounded by his family. And the book describes a deeply moving scene near the very end.
Set the scene.
He's in his bedroom, physically too weak to even walk down the stairs. The author is sitting quietly with him, looking through boxes of old photographs.
Okay.
They come across a faded black and white picture of his adoptive father, Paul Jobs.
The working-class repo man, the mechanic, the man he once felt intense shame for realizing he was smarter than.
Exactly. The man who taught him about the carbon microphone.
Right.
The author looks at the photo and murmurs something softly like, "He would have been proud of you."
And how does he react?
He, with very little physical energy left, looks up and corrects the author. He says with total conviction, "He was proud of me."
Wow.
In that single, quiet moment, the massive, chaotic narrative of the abandoned child, the ruthless rebel, the demanding tyrant, and the visionary genius, it all distills down to a son finding ultimate peace with the father who specifically picked him out.
It's an incredibly powerful resolution to his lifelong internal conflict. But as we reflect on this entire sprawling journey, I have to ask you a tough concluding question.
Okay, what is it?
If he had compromised, if he had gone to therapy to process his abandonment, if he had been a nicer boss, a more democratic leader, someone who cared more about his engineers' feelings than the exact micron curve of a plastic bezel.
Would the world have been deprived of the tools that define modern life? Does society fundamentally owe a debt to his demons?
That is the ultimate unsettling question of his legacy. The historical and biographical evidence strongly suggests that his demons and his genius were inextricably, permanently linked.
You cannot unweave them.
No. The exact same piercing intensity that made him ruthlessly scream at engineers and fire people in elevators is the exact same intensity that drove those engineers to do the impossible and create products that altered the trajectory of humanity.
If you remove the abrasive, uncompromising, reality-distorting control freak, you likely remove the Macintosh, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad.
We, as society, benefit endlessly from the sleek perfection of the products, but the people around him paid the heavy psychological price to forge them. Which brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. Steve Jobs famously quoted the phrase, "The journey is the reward."
He used that mantra to motivate his pirate team while they were killing themselves to build the Macintosh.
But looking at the massive totality of his life, one has to ask a deeper question. If the journey requires burning out your colleagues, abandoning your loved ones for years at a time, and driving yourself to the absolute physical and mental brink of madness, is the reward actually for the creator?
Or is the reward solely for the rest of us, who get to hold the beautiful, impossibly perfect devices left behind in the wreckage of that life?
It's a profound thought. It's something to deeply consider the next time you wake up and swipe a piece of perfectly polished glass to check your messages. I want to challenge you to apply his intense focus and his philosophy of deep simplicity to your own life. You don't have to be cruel to be focused. Look at your own projects. Eliminate the clutter. Drop the endless, boring PowerPoint presentations. Strip away the non-essential noise and focus fiercely on the absolute essence of your own work.
And please, I highly encourage you to reach out to the author, Walter Isaacson, on social media and share what surprised you most about this intense exploration of his work in psychology.
And again, I urge you to go out and purchase this book, Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. There are literally hundreds of brilliant, shocking, and inspiring stories in those pages detailing the engineering, the boardroom battles, and the personal triumphs that we simply didn't have time to mention today. Thank you so much for your active participation and for listening to this episode. We invite you to follow, subscribe, and share the Playing Books podcast with fellow learners and leaders. Until next time.